Hello and welcome to Unscripted. I'm Kavitah Wahi. Our featured guest for this edition of Unscripted is Karin Kneissl. Karin Kneissl is an Austrian diplomat, journalist, and politician. She served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Austria between the years 2017 and 2019 for the government of Sebastian Kurz, the third woman actually to hold this function. Prior to assuming her governmental position, she was a lecturer. She's also an expert in international law, history of West Asia, and the energy market, and she is also an author. Diplomacy Makes History, The Art of Dialogue in Uncertain Times, and the book My Middle East are just some samples of her work. Karin Kneissl, welcome to Unscripted.
Thank you very much, sir, for the invitation, and thank you for the kind introduction.
You're welcome. I hope I covered it all there. It's quite a resume, actually, and I'd like to actually start with something that I know you've tackled before, but I have to ask you, and it's about this quote from your book, My Middle East, where you criticize Zionism, founded by Theodor Herzl, as a blood and soil ideology. Now, you have said that this was taken out of context, but I have to ask you what that particularly means for people who may not have heard either about your book or this quote that you needed some clarification on.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a very heated debate even prior to my assignment as minister, because it was really taken out of context. If I may take an excursion into 19th century for 2 minutes.
Sure.
Thank you. Nationalism, as it was created throughout 19th century, whether it was German nationalism, whether it was Greek nationalism, and Zionism, Jewish nationalism, which was a latecomer. It really came with Herzl in the very late 1890s. They were all based on this idea that you need a connection between the soil and the people. And Herzl, and later also Ben-Gurion, in the first prime minister of Israel, who was very much marked by German nationalism, they all were inspired by this idea that Jews who were, let's say, to a certain degree, philosophers, scholars, they were not peasants for sure, because there was also had no right in many European countries to be landowners. So their desire was inspired by German nationalism to dominate the land. So soil and blood, what Bismarck also propagated, this was an inspiration for Jewish nationalism, as Zionism.
Part of the reason I think that this was maybe highlighted in terms of something taken out and then out of context, as you said, is because it comes into this anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic inclinations. I think that maybe has something to do with it. Unless I'm incorrect, please let me know. I mean, for example, it's somewhat hypocritical if you think about it when you take a look at what's considered Zionism to be premised on the fact that people can come back to a land of 1,000 years, right? But later, you have Palestinians who need to forget about what happened 70 years ago. I mean, that to me sounds like double standards in a way, and hypocritical. Do you think that this anti-Semitism applied there?
Yes, of course. I was accused as of day one of being anti-Semitic, and I was never ever allowed to come as an official to Israel. I said I don't mind. It's not a problem. There are 192 other countries which I can visit. Well, now they have become less because I'm living in Russia. But I didn't mind, It was just, you can easily morally destroy somebody who enters the public stage by calling that person an anti-Semitic. Then you're, so to say, morally destroyed. And what you just mentioned, I mean, you put the right quote. I compared it to German nationalism of 19th century. However, those who ran really a kind of media show against me as of November 2017, it was they accused me of having compared Zionism to National Socialism, which I never had done. But that was the story. I said back then already, thank God I'm not a man, I'm a woman in that office, because if I had been a man, in our times in the West by and large, first thing they try to find to make a dirty story is some sort of sexual harassment. And that happened to Julian Assange, that happened to Trump, inter alia, that happened to many people. And thank God I'm a woman, you know. Later on, I was accused only of anti-Semitism. I was only accused also in 2020 of witchcraft. So I had my other stories to go through. But thank God I'm not a man, so I was never accused of harassment.
Okay. I'd like to go and ask you about this quote that I'm going to quote right now, because it's very interesting. You said, quote, when UN resolutions refer to Israel in the pre-1967 borders, it is wrong on multiple levels, is what you said. And you said the reason is Israel has still not defined its national territory with reference to the state of war. Now, my question to you would be, should Israel be defined as having a territory? But what's interesting here is how, because of the state of war, is what your reasoning was. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, well, my reasoning is also by quoting the Israeli side. I mean, the Israelis have always said we cannot define our territory as long as we are in a state of war with the rest, which is not totally correct, because let us recall that there is Camp David from 1978, which led to a cold peace between Egypt and Israel. We have the treaty with Jordan from 1995. But what my PhD thesis was about frontiers and borders, because in English we have the interesting terminology. A frontier is something that is in movement, while a border or a boundary is a real line. A frontier is a space, a border is a line. And Israel is a typical frontier state, to the same extent like the United States was throughout 19th century in its making. Push where the grass is greener. If there hadn't been the Pacific Ocean, maybe the US settlers would have even gone further. But this taking of land is an ideology in terms of you have to run the space and you don't consider a line. So there's never a true border where the sovereignty of one ends and the sovereignty of the next starts. And this is the fundamental problem that you have in Israel, because when it's really now more than 30 years ago that I wrote my PhD, and I was wondering why Israel never defined its territory. And we have, as we all recall, a United Nations General Assembly resolution at the very beginning. It's from November 1947. But what happened in the first war between Israel and its Arab neighbors as of spring 1948 was, and let me quote here, a very interesting correspondence between Ben-Gurion and the first Israeli envoy to the United Nations, Abba Eban. Abba Eban asks in a telegram Ben-Gurion, I'm constantly questions here in the corridors of the United Nations at New York, where will be Israel borders? And Ben-Gurion responds very, very promptly saying, don't mention borders. Everything will be accomplished on the military battlefield. And this correspondence, I had the privilege to have access to it in the archives of the Israeli Prime Minister's office back in 1988. I had a scholarship at the Hebrew University, Mount Scopus, Jerusalem, and I was working on my PhD research. And I was the only Austrian there that was working. I had access to these archives, and I speak enough Hebrew to understand so that I could trace the archive material. And studying these primary sources, this correspondence between the Zionist movement and its envoys to the United Nations, all what happened in this first war, which is called from a Palestinian perspective, the big Nakba, the big battle, the defeat. So you could really go from one telegram to the next and establish, so to say, the red line. that the Zionists, because it was before the creation of the State of Israel, so to say between 1947 November and May 1948, they said, okay, let's accept this UN General Assembly resolution with several entities, which we don't like because there were many, many different borders, so to say, demarcation lines, but we will just accomplish facts militarily. And that's what they did, because the State of Israel, as it was then confirmed in the armistice agreements of 1949, had little to do with the General Assembly map. It was much larger. The whole of Galilee was in it. So because all they wanted was, of course, from their perspective, understandable, a cohesive territory.
Okay. Well, you know, I'd like to ask now what you back then said you were writing your thesis on, if I'm correct to have understood you, that when you referenced the UN on multiple levels, first of all, we look at the UN as the fact that it actually confirmed, it authorized, in a sense, and it accepted the whole notion of the existence of Israel. But when we take a look at borderless Israel, don't you think that right now that is perhaps one of the main reasons back then, perhaps, that this borderless notion was exercised by Israel and put into play, because we're looking at a behavior now that is expanding, or the intention of expanding the lines of Israel. We're seeing the way that Israel is behaving. From a UN perspective, do you think that it can even be referenced? Because the UN was in the first place the one that somewhat gave authenticity to the whole notion of Israel. And tell us what you see now in terms of the way Israel is behaving. Countries like Lebanon, Syria, and of course you can expand on that more for us.
Yeah. Well, let me first start with the question on legitimacy, because the United Nations, as you correctly said, was the sponsor of Israel, this General Assembly resolution in 1947. As of the very beginnings of the State of Israel, there was a big despise for the United Nations, whether it was the UN Blue Helmet contingents that were put as guardians of the armistices of 1949, whether it was with regard to UN envoys who were assassinated, like Count Bernadotte. The first Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, he called the United Nations the United Nothing. So it was a very deep despise for the United Nations, and we can see that as of day one. There was not a real interest in cooperating with the United Nations. Even so, Israel as a sovereign entity, together with an independent Arab state that was to be created, was legitimized, finds its legal basis in a United Nations General Assembly resolution. So, of course, this is a surreal contradiction, but that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. And that's question number one. On this borderless Israel, yes, Israel is a typical frontier state, and we had always a wide range of school of thought. We had, when we go back, for instance, to 1967, the so-called borders of 1967, really in inverted commas, which are not at all borders. They are ceasefire lines of June 1967. Everybody calls them borders. They are not borders, because borders have to be demarcated, they have to be agreed upon, and that never was the case. But in 1967, Israelis started to advance arguments of security. They said we need something like natural borders, Golan Heights, Jordan River, Suez Channel, whatever what they called natural borders back then. Right. There is no such thing as a real natural border. It's always a matter of perspective, or just borders. But they advanced all sorts of arguments. So in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the voices on behalf of security were dominant. As of the late 1970s, with the rise of religious nationalism, with the rise of Likud, and people like Begin and Sharon and then all the others, yes, it was more and more about going back to Eretz Israel, which is the much larger notion of where we don't know where it starts and where it ends. Former Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, he mocked those national religious politicians by saying they walk around with the Bible as a kind of cataster. You know, they open up certain pages of the Bible and say, this here was where our tribes settled in 3,000 years ago, and that's why we have to settle again.
Sure.
Well, these
let me jump in here, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, because I'm trying to form this idea that lies behind the UN in terms of referencing it. You know, you have an agency or an organization that has been criticized. It's not new news. It's been decades in the making how they have said the UN needs to be reorganized. It needs to be restructured. But when you take a look at the UN itself, I'd like to ask you about one of its branches called the IAEA, for example, okay?
Yeah.
What are we looking at when we take a look at the IAEA? Are we looking at an impartial organization there? I believe that you have some insight there that perhaps you can shed more light, because we're looking right now at Iranian officials, Iranian governments, who are, to say, for lack of a better word, disconnected themselves, and the descriptions they have attributed to the IAEA Director General is not very pleasant, as I'm sure you're well aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, the IAEA was, in my opinion, the most technical special body of the United Nations, and that gave it a certain clout. But in my opinion, it has become much more a partisan player than a truly United Nations agency throughout the 1990s, when it was all about denuclearizing Iraq. And later on, Iran had a similar fate to a certain extent, because there was so much focus on Iraq and currently on Iran. And there was not the same kind of agenda when you take, again, coming back to Israel or coming back to other countries, which, for instance, India and Pakistan, surprise, surprise, in 1998, they had their nuclear weapons all of a sudden. And the IAEA safeguards never had a clue about it. So this causes a lot of question marks. And the current leadership, the current Director General of the IAEA, has definitely harmed the organization. We will see whether he will be re-elected. But when I may compare him to his predecessors, who I both had the privilege to meet and discuss with, Mohammed El-Baradei and Hans Blix, they always had a tightrope walk. It's not easy to be Director General of the IAEA, but you need some backbone, you need, if I may say, some character. And let us recall that Hans Blix in 2002, 2003, when the US was pushing for an invasion into Iraq, he really did his utmost to preempt that. He was literally running to and fro, trying to bring the evidence that there is no evidence for weapons of mass destruction. And these people were committed. I don't see this commitment to the cause, to the main agenda of the IAEA right now.
Could I ask you point blank, sorry again to jump in, that their accusations, one of them is the fact that the IAEA Director General actually revealed the sensitive information about Iranian nuclear scientists, which in part attributed to the targeted assassinations that took place not only in the past, but also in this most recent Israeli aggression against Iran. Do you believe that that was the case? Because there are documentation of the IAEA Director General meeting with Israeli officials.
Yeah. Well, I remember that I have read about this case. I did not know the details. You're just revealing to me those details. I was not aware of those. What I read was that around 3-4 weeks ago, the Iranian government officials had said they had got hold of documentation that would illustrate this doubtful role of Mr. Grossi, the Director General. What I think is mostly to the discredit of the Director General and how he harmed the entire institution of safeguard system, how he harmed also the non-proliferation treaty, is that he simply shut up when it was important to open his mouth. I mean, he did not show any kind of it's not rocket science what he has to do even though it's a complicated topic, but it is to distinguish right from wrong. And he was not able to do that prior to June 13th. And maybe his kind of ambiguity, because he was never really calling a spade, he never clearly said, according to our safeguard findings, there is no nuclear, there's no nuclear bomb to be about ready on the Iranian side. He never really clearly said that.
Indeed.
His reports.
Okay, I'm going to, unfortunately, we're so short in time. I'm going to reference my last question about this Israeli aggression against Iran. That was 12 days, and you had a ceasefire that was announced. You wrote in your book, Diplomacy Makes History, The Art of Dialogue on Uncertain Times, where you said diplomacy means commitment to dialogue, no matter the circumstances. Iran did that. Iran went into the talks, and you had what happened on the 61st day. The bombing campaign backed by the U.S. and probably orchestrated in conjunction with the Israeli regime where this war of aggression happened. What do you think about the fact that Israel went ahead and did what it did and how things turned out?
From an Iranian perspective, there's a total loss in trust, which I totally understand. I said recently also that I deeply respect the Iranian officials who were ready to negotiate once again with the US administration after all what has happened, after all the very nasty experience of the JCPOA of July 2015, exactly 10 years ago. There was a lot of hope that things would turn normal, that there would be investments in Iran, that Iran would just open up. All that never came materialized because the US sanctions continued, and then in 2018 we had the withdrawal by the United States. And still Iran was ready to negotiate. So my respect. And now that
why do you say that? When you say that, because I know you have said in the past that Iran should not trust the Westerners any longer and should actually not negotiate with the Westerners again. Do you believe that?
Well, I think this is more Ayatollah Khamenei who has been very, very clear on that. I'm not totally on his line, if I may say. But
of course you can say.
Yeah, but what I would say is that I have deep respect that the Iranians tried so many times to negotiate. And if I were now an Iranian official, I don't know whether I would still use the same venue. You know, maybe there should be some new venue. It's just a very personal idea from my side. I didn't discuss it with anybody, but there's also Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is all about security and energy. They're partners of you, like the People's Republic of China, with whom you have a long-term partnership. Russian Federation is in there. Maybe Iran should look for new venues because to be in this bilateral relation, Washington on one side, Tehran on the other, I know that everybody, I remember in 2013, many people told me, well, only when Tehran negotiates with Washington, there will be a breakthrough. That happened as of November 2013 with the so-called Geneva Agreement that Obama announced, we are negotiating with Iran. That was the big, big surprise. Former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif established a very good climate of trust with his colleague John Kerry. So everything looked nice and smart and
right.
From a diplomatic.
Well, we know what happened. And again, I got only 1 minute left, and I do apologize for jumping in. But maybe the language that best is understandable for the Israeli regime and the U.S. was what occurred. We don't promote violence. We only responded and retaliated to the Israeli aggression that initiated the war. And I'm sure you're aware about Iran's military power in terms of the damage that it incurred. Do you think that that occurrence in itself has now made the U.S. and the Israeli regime reevaluate what they did? Because many concluded the U.S. came to rescue Israel in less than a minute.
I hope so.
All right, very well. Thank you very much. We'll end it on that. It was a pleasure to have you. We do appreciate it, taking the time to talk to us. That was our guest there talking to us from Karin Kneissl, the Austrian diplomat, journalist and politician. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of Unscripted. You can catch a repeat of the program on our website, www.presstv.ir. From Mikhail and the team here at Unscripted is goodbye.